Good afternoon, and welcome to the NASCA Lab, Driving Savings Through Agile Real Estate and Facility Strategies. I'm Herman Bowles, Vice Chairman of JLL. You know, it's really great to be here today. We've got some great people, but what we want to do now is we want to review some contemporary issues that are facing state chief administrative officers. And you know, with this panel, we can also review some of the best practices and thought leadership and innovations pertaining to those issues. I know you're all happy to be here today, and we know we're in really some critical times as we think about it. Think about what's going on in our world right now. In the medical health situation, we have COVID. We have social issues related to racism and the pandemic. We have political issues with the election that we just went through, and now we must have a continuation of government. And there are definitely implications to COVID that we're seeing, right? All of you see it. There are health and safety issues, not only for our employees, but for our customers, the clients and citizens of each state that we place. There are workplace strategies that we must think of. Are we virtual? How do we create a place? How do we make sure that our people continue to work together as a team? And all of that comes down to real estate and facilities. And what are the technology implications from that as we look for what is the best way for us to provide services and give our customers and employees the best way to do that? How do we respond to this? Well, we know at anything, leadership is very important, and that's what state administrative officers do. But we also need agility. We need innovation. And we also need to understand what is the common goal that we're looking for as we have a safe environment for our employees and our citizens. You know, as I think about a historical perspective of what's happened in real estate that you don't think of as a technical industry, there are changes that take place. Generally speaking, looking at outsourcing, it initially started in the private sector. Then it went over to the GSA, the federal government level, because they have a centralized process where by fiat they can say these things need to happen. And then I'll call the governments, state government and local government, sort of a lower laggard follower, so to speak. And that's where we are in a lot of these processes that we're using now. And then we look at colleges and universities, and due to their structure of tenure and things of this nature, they're the last to adopt many of these changes. But what we want to do now is think of what are some of the high level challenges that are being faced by each of you out there. And we already talked about the pandemics that are going on. We talked about the fact now that work from home is not just an idea, it's something that's really happening. And as a result of that, we have to look at our space needs. What are they immediately? What will they be in the short, midterm? And what will they be in the long term? And what role would digitization and technology play in that? And most important of all, what about culture? That comes down to human resources, how we interact with one another. How are we going to recruit the next generation of workers? Where they're going to work? So what is the value of a place in the new virtual world? And how are we going to make that happen? We've got a very, very esteemed panel that we're going to help us talk about this today. And I'd like to now introduce each of those panel members. Veitch is the Executive Director of Department of Personnel Administration from the state of Colorado. She brings extensive nonprofit, public, and private sector experience to her role. And in addition to that, she has a lot to do. She's managing all of the building complexes in the Capitol, as well as statewide real estate planning, construction, energy conservation, and real estate transactions. In her time with the state, she's driven a series of initiatives aimed at making state an employer of choice and the department more collaborative as it services its state agencies. Our second guest today has a very interesting job, and perhaps she'll share some of the exciting stuff she did with and for us here in the state of Virginia in early November. And that's Keyanna Connor. She's the Secretary of Administration for the Commonwealth of Virginia. In her role, she oversees the Department of General Services, which includes the Division of Engineering and Buildings and the Division of Real Estate and Facilities Management. And they both have oversight responsibility throughout the state. She also has the Department of Human Resources Management, the Department of Elections, and I bet that's been fun, Keyanna, and also the Department Virginia Information Technologies Agency and the Compensation Board. She previously served as the State Director and Director of Government and Community Affairs for U.S. Senator Mark Warner, and she's the primary contact between the Senator's office and representatives of state and local governments. So welcome, Keyanna. And last but not least, my colleague from JLL, Bernice Boucher, she's a managing director in our consulting practice, and she's worked more than 20 years in workplace strategy and change management. And she's an occupancy expert, and she advises clients on enhancing the productivity of their people, their workplace, and the real estate portfolio. So she's going to really give us some insight here. But why don't we start? I'd like to ask each of our state representatives, and Cara, we'll start with you since you've been a member longer. What are some of the issues that or challenges that you're dealing with right now in view of that outline that I provided to open us up?
Sure, Herman. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. For us, this whole process starts with employees. And in 2019, we went around the state and met with employees in person. We also did an employee engagement survey. And so we have feedback from well over half of our employees as to what's important to them. And we gave them a variety of things to rank: compensation, merit, career growth, then flexible work arrangements. So how do we deliver flexible work arrangements? That has been our goal from an employee perspective and also a customer perspective. COVID and the quick pivot to remote work in March allowed us to overcome some of those hurdles that were preventing us from moving to flexible work arrangements in the beginning. So lots of managers were concerned about, will my team perform? How do I do this? And we had to do it very quickly. We have about 62% of state employees working remotely every day in Colorado. So now we've demonstrated that we can. This gives us the incredible opportunity to look at our real estate portfolio. So we have about $2.3 million of lease space, private lease space, and 1.6 million square feet, 2.3 million square feet and 1.6 million square feet in interagency lease space. So as we go through and look at this, where do we want to be? Where do we want our employees to work? How do we want them to work? So tying into also your IT perspective. So we are currently going through a process in Colorado right now where every single agency identified every single employee where they worked in January and where we envision them working when it comes back to being able to return safely to work for everybody. We've just completed that analysis. I'm sure there are all kinds of fancy tools, but one of the big hurdles here is money. We didn't have money to bring on a new tool or to hire an amazing vendor to help us through the process. The next step for us is to, as the agencies did that for all of their employees, every single seat, where does that seat sit in the future? We also looked at our leases. What leases do we want to keep? What leases do we want to end? When do they end? And are currently in the process of developing, we want to move agency A into this building because we also own millions of square feet in buildings. But like many states, 56% of our buildings were built before 1980. And so we're constantly challenged with how do we maintain these buildings? And as we reimagine what work could look like and reimagine what space could look like for our employees, we don't have the money to fix these new spaces. So we can pull people out of commercial lease space, put them in private lease space, but it's still really old lease or really old owned space. And so really a challenge for us has been money, but not the will to get it done. Employees want this, managers are seeing this as an opportunity to recruit and retain. The other challenge that we're thinking through long-term is how do we maintain culture and team. So moving a bunch of your team remote creates a very different environment. We have about a 15% turnover rate at the state. So right now we're pretty familiar with our teams, but in 2 years that really changes. And so we need to support our managers and supervisors and employees with the tools and resources they need to maintain teams. So lots of opportunities for us as we reimagine how and where we deliver government services and how we recruit and retain. But COVID has really created this opportunity for us on a much broader scale than we imagined in 2019.
Fantastic, Cara, and it seems like you're on top of it. And it was interesting. You said, certainly budget is part of it, and we're going to talk about that later, but that's not the only part. And as I said earlier, leadership is critical, and it seems that you've got your state on a great process. Now let's turn over here to my home state of Virginia. And Keyanna, we are so happy to have you, and the fact that you're getting very much involved in the NASCA activities. I think you're going to find it to be a fantastic group. And we can think now, Cara was talking about her state, and you became a state much longer earlier, I should say, than Cara. So you perhaps even have some other challenges as well.
We do, but I think Cara did a great job kind of highlighting what all of us are experiencing and working through right now as state chief administrators. You know, I'll start with challenges from a very high level. And I think the first that we all went through is continuity of government. Continuity of government in a time where how we deliver our services have drastically changed. What we're seeing right now is a need and a drive to accelerate both our workforce and our IT transformation. That we stay competitive with other states and that we're able to deliver services to the citizens at the level in which they expected. There are changing expectations of how citizens want to interact with the government. And we are having to take a step back and start to be more strategic and forward thinking in how we meet those expectations of our taxpayers. As Cara kind of talked through the real estate footprint that she sees there, here in the Commonwealth, we're about 40% lease space to about 60% owned space. Bold opportunities with this real estate market to really reevaluate our footprint. There's going to be opportunities for us to look at spaces that we currently own right now that are no longer either meeting our needs or becoming too costly to upkeep, right? And so whether we want to decide of putting those on the market and taking advantage of where we are right now is a consideration. The next thing is once we take that step, we're able to look at acquiring new assets, bring those online that are more modern and that help our agencies deliver on their missions. As we look at how we deal with our workforces in our current buildings, the first thing I'm thinking about when it comes to remote work, this is something that's going to continue, but it also raises an equity challenge for us. You have some employees that while they may want to be 100%, 50% remote, just by the nature of their job, they need to be in the office, or they need to be in the front of the office interacting with citizens. And that's not something that we can change. So how do we handle that culture shift? Right? And how do we meet our employees, their expectations and their needs at the same time? Coordinating among agencies. When I think about how I can, make our buildings more cost effective, if we're going to go the route of more remote workforce, and we look at certain days or weeks in which agencies are co-located in one building so that I can close down other buildings and drive down costs in those areas. We're also looking at co-locating agencies with similar types of missions, right? Those that are primarily either front, middle, or back office, having them in similar spaces with a similar design that meets their needs. All of this will require unprecedented collaboration across different secretariats and different agencies. And that's what we're focused on right now, is trying to get a good idea of where our agencies are, where they want to go, and how we, through the Department of General Services, can help them and guide them in their planning.
Fantastic. Well, Keyanna and Cara, we really appreciate the landscape that you've put out there. When we look at this, everybody always says, okay, is government really different than the corporate sector and how we manage our people, how we manage our real estate? And what I'd like to do now is ask Bernice. You've had the opportunity to hear these young ladies talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities that they have in the public sector. From your perspective, first of all, dealing with Fortune 500 companies, some brand names, and maybe you can mention some of them across the nation who were looked at as leaders in terms of the best place to work, et cetera, et cetera. How do you take what you've heard from Cara and Keyanna and compare that to what's going on in the private sector right now?
The private sector is, thank you, Herman, very much. Thank you for having me. I would say the private sector is wrestling with exactly the same questions and challenges that the states are. So it's been very interesting for me to hear more about what you see as the challenges. How do you more fully embrace work from home post-pandemic? What kind of impact does it have on employee experience, on employee performance and productivity? What kind of impact will it have on your workspace and your real estate portfolios? These are all the questions that the private sector is dealing with. So it's actually a universal question that everyone's dealing with.
Okay, very good. So if we think about what some best practices might be, Bernice, from what you've heard our panelists talk about so far. Is there anything around best practices that you can think of?
There are a few different things that would be helpful. One of the things I think it's really important to do is to really align with leadership on what their perspective is around embracing remote work, working from home more fully. Like Keyanna was saying, there are some people whose jobs must be done in the office. But for those jobs that could be fully remote, how does the leadership actually feel about that as a program moving forward post vaccine? How do the various business departments or business units feel about that as well? I think understanding employee perception around what they miss around the office, what they enjoy about working remotely, about what they'd like to, do about coming back to the office, how many days, for instance, they'd be interested in coming back. Things like aligning on what are the technologies that will be required, the policies and programs. Most companies are going to a hybrid mobility program, which is a combination of working from home and also working in the office. So, but what percentages? Calculating that will be really important because it'll have an impact on how much real estate you need and also the kind of real estate you need. People will be able to do their heads down work at home. Then coming into the office to an assigned desk doesn't really make sense anymore, does it? People will want to come in to collaborate, to connect socially with their colleagues, to come in for learning and development, coming in to convene for special events, or just connect with the culture. So all of those things will need to be considered as organizations make decisions about the future.
Okay, Keyanna and Cara, I'd like to ask each of you, how much work from home do you have now? And what do you see happening to that trend over the next year as we get a COVID vaccine, or say next 2 to 3 years?
Heck yeah.
I can tell you right now, our buildings are at 10% occupancy. So that tells you that we are overwhelmingly remote workforce, except for, let's say, our Virginia Employment Commission offices, our DMVs, of course, our hospitals, those sites in which you're interacting with a client and or a customer. When I think about the future, this is certainly something that will continue. It is more a question of what's a good balance post COVID, because I tell people we're not going to go back to pre-COVID-19 days, right? There will be a new normal for us, and agency leadership has to, come to a decision on what that would look like. I do think that we've done a great job of reinforcing with our leadership and with our managers that it shouldn't be line of sight for your employee. How many hours are sitting at that desk? You have to start measuring productivity and results. So COVID has given us this blessing that we can now say all the way up the chain that teleworking can work, and for some it is even more productive.
Got 1 point, 10% in Virginia. What's going on in Colorado?
Sure, we're at 62%, and I think, Keyanna, you spoke to your offices. So statewide, that includes our prisons and our healthcare facilities. We're at 62% remote work. Our offices are about the same, about 10%. And when we went through the process so we managed the process statewide, but also for our department of where do people want to work in a safe environment, we're hearing anywhere from once every 2 weeks to come in for that collaboration that Bernie spoke about to maybe 2 or 3 days. We're hearing almost nobody say, I want to come back to the office every day. And that really changes how we do work and what our workspaces look like, right? It doesn't make sense to have offices, all these offices anymore where people go to a specific office. We need to change our spaces to be much more collaborative spaces, more breakout rooms. How do we put the right IT into those rooms? So all the things we're starting to think about.
So both of you have the opportunity from a state perspective to work with personnel as well as real estate. And we know one of the things that's important as we look at this technological world that we're going into is culture. And what is the impact that has? So as you think about, Keyanna, I think you said you had 15% turnover a year. So if you think about 3.5 years, you've had 50% of your workforce move out. So you've got work from home, you've got new employees coming in. How are you attracting and attracting those new employees? And how are you integrating them into the culture that you have, or should I say the culture that you want?
You know, I'd be interested to see what Cara says here, but we've actually seen this year very low attrition, right? We are not seeing that turnover that we're used to seeing. That presents a challenge for us, but it also presents, we're continuing with that institutional knowledge, but we're not having those vacancies that we normally would to recruit in, you know, fresher talent. I think what we also experienced here are hiring freezes. You know, we've just moved out of one. The Commonwealth of Virginia is back hiring. For those critical to fill positions that we continue to recruit for, we were even seeing a decrease in applicants. And so, you know, I still think it's too early to tell what the major driver or influence was there. I think a lot of candidates thought that government simply were going through a freeze and were not applying. But this is an unusual time for us, and I'll say I still think we're figuring it out. What we are trying to do for our workforce to make sure that they stay engaged and to keep our culture and our morale high is we are having tons of virtual leadership and development programs, as well as employee engagement. We're still trying to keep the community connected, even though we're doing it from either our homes and for some, like me, still my office.
Okay.
Right,
All right.
I would echo that, Keyanna. We are seeing a lower turnover rate than we've seen in the past, and that's kind of brought some stability, for better or worse, as we have transitioned. I think as we move into the new environment, we have more people working remotely. We really have to be intentional about our culture. In the past, you kind of, there's some posters on the walls and you talk about it a little bit, but in this remote environment, you really need to put people front and center and your culture front and center. So talking about your values, talking about what it looks like when someone demonstrates those values, putting in programs that reward demonstrations of values. We are also spending a lot of time on employee engagement, both big and small, right? So whether those are 5 minutes at the front of the meeting to say, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Those kind of tiny touches that we miss so much because we're not in the office anymore, to more big department-wide things where we take a minute and talk about the place we want to travel again, when we get to travel or something like that. The one thing I do worry about is we know that minorities feel isolated in a workforce when we are together in person. And I worry even more about that in a remote environment when we bring on people and people feel even more isolated. So it'll be a lot of learning, I think, for everyone as we figure out how do we onboard and really bring on new members of our team so that they feel like part of our team. And we don't just create all these individual silos so people are just doing their work, but they really feel like they belong and are included.
Fantastic. Bernice, you've heard 10% for administrative space in terms of these two governments. How does that compare to what's going on in the corporate market, number one? And to follow up on that, for the culture market, what are the corporates doing to think about culture and maintaining the positives and, of course, looking at an opportunity to improve on the negative cultural aspects? That particularly what Cara said about people being not engaged and not feeling as if they belong.
Right. And with your first question around the percentages, it's the corporate sector is very much aligned. So anywhere from 5 to 15% of office workers are back in the office. There are some that never left, just like in the public sector. You know, if you're having labs, so think about all the life sciences and pharmaceutical firms, they're working furiously on vaccines and other types of treatments for COVID and other diseases, right? And so they have lots of experiments happening in labs. Same things with the tech sector and other, you know, essential employees that needed to be in the office. But that sort of volunteer employee, for instance, many banks have brought traders back to the office, even though this was a huge experiment around sending traders home. That was like unheard of. And when it comes to culture, I'd say that every organization I speak to is concerned about it. They're concerned about eroding culture, eroding that culture of creativity and innovation around products and services and the development of those things. But what's interesting about what's happened is that all of these Zoom calls have made connections between people a bit more authentic. We all learn more about each other, our homes, our pets, our kids. Before you got back to the office, there were so many things. I'm looking at Herman's office. I'm looking at other aspects of what's going on in people's homes. I've had calls where people's pets and kids have been involved, and we've all become a bit more tolerant, a lot more tolerant of what people's lives are all about. And honestly, in the office, we really weren't that exposed to those things. So one of the side benefits of working remotely has been this new authenticity and connection with our colleagues. And I will even say with people who are not our colleagues. For me, I'm in the business of speaking to a lot of companies about the future of work, and everyone's on Zoom calls and I'm seeing their homes. So it's opened up a new door. But I think that we've been forced into this situation, and it's also encouraged companies to really think about what is their culture? How do you actually define it? What are those words that you use about your culture? What is that talk? And how are you going to walk the talk for the next year, potentially, when a bulk of your population will still be working remotely? So as Kara said, it's very much about being intentional about your culture. If you say you're about trust, then why are you going to micromanage people about their productivity and performance at home? What are those various aspects of your culture and how you define it? Are you going to make sure that the behaviors and actions that you exhibit actually reinforce that culture? So it's a good time to really look at culture, really define it. In fact, that's something that we're doing with our clients, to say we have a great culture, but we've never written it down. We've never said what are the things that you can say and what you can do and what you shouldn't say and what you shouldn't do as a result of culture. So I think it's a great time to be looking at that and really understanding, especially around onboarding when you're bringing new employees on. Make sure they have a mentor and a buddy. Make sure you're spending great time with them. Set up some informal coffee talks and coffee chats. Do what you need. You have to do that additional outreach. Like I said, be more intentional about your culture.
Fantastic. And Cara and I've had a few conversations, and I got to see her kids, and she got to meet my wife. So, I mean, I think these are some of the positive things that are going on from this Zoom existence that we have. And,
Mhm.
and Cara, continuing on that, in terms of productivity and efficiency, however you measure it, during this pandemic and the external workforce, work from home, what has happened to the productivity in your state? And Keyanna, you can get ready for the same question.
Sure. I think because we pivoted to remote work in a crisis, people are used to working at a crisis pace at home. And so we're seeing productivity through the roof. And now my concern is more around how do we create this sustainable remote work, right? People are on their computers at all hours of the night. Like, how many times have we all told employees, don't email us at 10 o'clock at night, get off your computer. And then we email them at 10 o'clock at night, right? So, but really, how do we create a sustainable remote work culture, right? What does that look like? What are our expectations? I don't expect you to be on at 5 just because your computer is at home. And then being very intentional around empowering employees, right? So what am I asking you to do? Giving them the resources and then holding them accountable. It doesn't mean micromanaging along the day. It doesn't mean giving me a report every day to say you've done X. We're really looking at those outcomes. So I'm less concerned about productivity being too low and burnout being way too high. Of course, we have pockets of people who have figured out how to game the system and are working a little less. And for those, we performance manage them, right? They are getting productivity measures and accountability. But for most of the employees, almost overwhelmingly, we've seen productivity go through the roof.
Okay, how are my tax dollars being used, Keyanna?
It's the same here. No concerns about productivity. I'm more concerned about emotional health of our workforce right now because we have gone through this global pandemic. We had to transition how we worked pretty much overnight. And to Kara's point, people are working around the clock, right? And it's because you no longer have that difference between home and work. Work is home. And so I think we are trying to say to our folks, make sure that self-care is a part of your routine because it's really important. The services that you provide to Herman as a citizen, we need you and we need you at your best. We currently don't have any productivity tracking tools, no analytics. I know this is something that is starting to bubble up out there and we're doing some research, but from what managers are seeing, right? To Kara's point, it's outcomes, it's results. That's what we're looking at. And if our managers are seeing problems, they have a great opportunity to address them head on. And that's what we encourage our folks to do.
So Keyanna, let's stay with you for a second and let's talk about the budget issue. So your DMV, you're not getting money for it. Some employment is down, so therefore you're not getting as much tax revenue. So in a sense, you aren't getting the money that you have. You've got a rainy day fund you go into, but there are other things that you're going to have to do. What are some of the challenges with the budget that you're facing?
Yeah, so here in Virginia, I think we did see a $2.7 billion shortfall, but that was far below what we anticipated. And I'll tell you, I think states are faring far better than local governments because we're not as focused on, tourism and other areas. So our local governments are certainly feeling the pain and the strain more than we are here at the state level. We took a unique strategy in the Commonwealth and we unallotted future spending, right? So we did not eliminate it. We said, we're going to put the pause on that until we do a new forecast and know exactly where we're going. Our General Assembly is coming to a close here. They came in for a special session to look at the budget, and we are about to put in place that spending that we paused for short term. So I think that we are faring well, in part because of stimulus from the federal government. And I am hoping that, whatever administration prevails through this, that they will see that our states and local governments need continued support from the federal government.
Well, she must know something about this election we don't know, huh? This day. Okay, Kara, same question. Budget.
Sure. So we highlighted the issue with maintaining our buildings, and then what are the new workspaces that we want in the future for our employees? And we're thinking more creatively about how to do this, right? Do we enter into a P3 to develop a building with a private venture? Do we do a capture and bond against lease savings as we get out of these leases so that we can have some money to fix our buildings? And trying to think differently about how we do maintenance. Maintenance has always been kind of like the last thing funded almost, and we're almost at the level we're only funding emergency maintenance. But really thinking through, as we need these spaces to recruit and retain and to be the spaces where people come together to collaborate, like Keyanna said, across departments. This is a great opportunity to put focused agencies in the same building. So we're having money challenges, but this again is encouraging us to think more creatively out of the box for solutions.
Okay, we're getting close to the end here. So Bernice, real quickly, corporates with their capital budgets, they can't buy fiat tax like perhaps our two state administrators can. They got to sell products. What are you seeing real quickly in that area? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. When we look at the corporate sector, there's just as much concern about spending as everyone else. And I would say that, for instance, that's why there's so much emphasis right now in looking at their real estate portfolios. Is there a way to decrease operating cost? And they're also looking at what they can do when people do return. Can they continue to use space the way that it is, or will they need to invest in the space? There are some organizations that are finding themselves doing well through this pandemic, and they can invest in their space. And there are many others who are saying, this is not a time to be investing in our space. We can invest in our people. We can invest in our technology. So every company has their own challenges. There's no one size fits all, but yes, of course, everyone's looking at, if I don't have to spend any CapEx, I'm just not.
Okay, well, Bernice, Cara, Keyanna, we want to really thank each of you for sharing your insight with us today. And in the end, as I said at the beginning, it comes down to great leadership. And I think all three of you in your respective areas are showing a great opportunity to help us all go. And I think it's very phenomenal that we have all these women experts on here as well. So women power, you guys keep doing it. So we'd like to thank the audience as well for joining us. And if you have any questions, we're going to be available here very shortly to keep the conversation going. So on behalf of NASCA and the great team that Pam and has put together for us, we'd want to thank you very much again for being with us this afternoon. Thank you very much.